to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is John Wood. Randy Isaac, our regular host, is away this week, but he will be returning in October for our regular monthly series, and he has both October, November, and December lined up with excellent topics and conversations. You'll be sure to want to join us for that. This month has been our practice is following a very successful annual meeting in Washington, D.C. We interview one of the plenary speakers. And so today is our real pleasure and my pleasure to have Brandon Vaidyanathan with us. And he's the associate professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the Catholic University of America there in Washington, D.C. He's also the director of the Institutional Flourishing Lab. And that's a topic that I would like to ask him more about, maybe later in our program. So, Brandon, welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions today.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and good to see all of you. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday afternoon here and whatever time of day it is where y'all are.
Right. Well, we're going to get to know you a little bit, Brandon. So first, just maybe you can tell us a little bit about where you were born and raised, and then we'll move to your journey here to Washington, D.C. So where were you born?
Yeah, I was born in Qatar, in the Middle East, and spent very little time there, maybe just a couple of years. My parents are from India. They were working in the Arabian Gulf, and they got there before I was born. And I spent most of my childhood in a country called Oman, which most people don't know or have not visited. It's a beautiful, sleepy country on the Arabian Peninsula. Maybe 14 years there, a couple of years in India, 4 years in the United Arab Emirates, and then 8 years in Canada, and then I've been in the United States since 2007.
Hmm. Oh, fascinating. 8 years in Canada was, as you know, I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and have traveled the world not near as much as you have. But tell us a bit more about that from Canada to the US. And then in particular, how did you end up at the Catholic University?
Yeah, gosh, it's a really circuitous story. I mean, I started out, I moved to Canada for undergraduate studies because it was cheaper than being in the United Arab Emirates where I was living. Um, I started out in New Brunswick, spent a bit of time in Toronto, and then really finished my undergrad at St. Francis Xavier, St. FX in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
So I was in Nova Scotia for a good bit of time. I was discerning the Catholic priesthood for a few years. I was in Ottawa for a little bit, and then ended up leaving seminary, went to do another business degree in Montreal at the HEC, the French business school there. And throughout my undergraduate training, the question that really was paramount for me was, what is meaningful work? Is work meaningful, or can work be a vocation? Is there any purpose to work, or is it just something you do as a necessary evil? And the reason I was thinking about that was I just before I started college, I had converted to Christianity, and I found a lot of my Christian friends were living the sort of work as a necessary evil kind of model of working. You got to pay the bills, and
Right.
ultimately it's just something you got to do. And I had the luxury of being outside that environment in a liberal arts university,
Mhm.
uh, taking courses in the humanities and social sciences, and asking big questions about meaning and purpose, while also trying to grapple with faith. And so all of that, I think, had gotten me thinking about meaning and purpose in work. And as I was doing, these business degrees, I mean, I really wanted to study philosophy, but there's no way I could get my dad to pay for a philosophy degree. But eventually, my mentors in my master's program and in the business school in Montreal really encouraged me to go the academic route. And even in my master's program, I started doing field work, which was in the early 2000s. We were looking at the offshoring of service work in big tech companies to India, and they wanted to know like what's going on on the ground for people who are sleeping in the day, working at night, pretending to be in the United States or in Australia and so on. What happens to them, right? So the way in which people juggle that relationship between tradition and modernity became the big question that I realized I needed the tools of sociology to understand. And so the more I
Mhm.
got into this work, the more I realized I need to really figure out this discipline, and that drew me to do a doctorate in sociology at Notre Dame with Christian Smith, who was at that point really interested in questions of multiple modernities. So what it is modernity a homogenizing steamroller, or are there multiple pathways that you start from different cultural starting points, you might end up in different places. And so that was the kind of theoretical perspective that I was really interested in trying to understand. So I did a lot of research on corporate culture, across nationally. Started doing a
Mhm.
big project with Elaine Howard Eklund at Rice University on religion among scientists, and we did that for a few years. I worked for a foundation in Texas, a Christian foundation, on mental health, and then trying to figure out how to help the church better respond to mental health needs. And at that time, I got recruited by Catholic University to come and rebuild their sociology department, which was kind of collapsing. So yeah, it's a kind of long, circuitous story, but trying to integrate these realms of business, science, and religion, and sociology was a helpful approach. I mean, I've been just sort of making empirical interventions in philosophical and theological questions, I think, the last couple of decades.
Fascinating. It is a quite a convoluted journey. Thank you for giving that quick thumbnail sketch of it, because it is sort of, in some ways, for some of us in the ASA, that's just quintessential ASA journey. For many of us, it's we have much more straight line journeys. I'm looking at Dana and myself, and our journeys, as we've talked and learned over the years, have been quite convoluted. It's fascinating how the Lord leads us in different directions to bring us to this place to make contributions like the one you have made to this notion of beauty in the sciences, and that beauty and diversity in the sciences. I think your title at our annual meeting was The Diversity of Beauty in Science. And that talk is, if it's not up already, will soon be up on the ASA website. And those of us who were at the meeting, of course, can access that. And that brings us to where we're at today. But one thing I wanted to mention, Brandon, for our audience, is that in the chat, we've put up a link to the BioLogos podcast. And there was a half an hour, 50-minute interview that you had with Jim Stump and BioLogos, in which you elaborate on your faith journey and your early life. And I'd urge you folks to go and listen sometime to that. It's just absolutely fascinating and very helpful conversation. So thanks for that introduction. Well, as we get going here, I'd like to ask about the specific topic that you got. And you mentioned Elaine Howard Eklund, who was our Winter Symposium speaker this last year. And we've known Elaine's work and interacted with her. So, how is it that you got into this particular topic of beauty in the sciences? How did that come up?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, a couple of things had happened. One, when I was at some point finishing up my graduate studies, I was taking a course on social movements, and at the reigning theories at that time to try to make sense of why people get involved in social movements was that they are propelled by negative emotional shocks, right? So moral outrage. And
Mm-hmm.
something seemed to be missing for me in that account, because if we're reacting to the loss of something precious, then
Mm-hmm.
that assumes that there is something, some kind of ideal of something that's not only good or true, but something beautiful. So something attractive, something valuable, something precious has been taken away, or needs to be restored. And so I stumbled upon a book by Harvard, I think she's a scholar of literature, Elaine Scarry, called On Beauty and Being Just. It was the Tanner lecture she gave in 1997, I think. And so this connection between beauty and justice was for me quite revolutionary. I would never have thought of connecting those terms. And around the time I was reading that work and seeing the connections between beauty and justice, I started working with Elaine Howard Eklund, and we did
Mm-hmm.
this, study of scientists in a number of countries. And in our field work, we were asking scientists, um, why do you, we did about maybe 600 something interviews, in-depth interviews, for maybe 2 hours each. And we would ask them, why do you make the sacrifices you do for the,
Mm.
many of them sacrifice, well-paying jobs, in industry or their family lives or their health. And we were surprised to hear them say, because it's beautiful. And that word beauty kept coming up
Yeah.
really often. And so I happened to be sharing some of these results at a conference, and the VP of Templeton Religion Trust came up and said, "Would you like to do an inquiry on beauty? We don't know what's going on. This sounds really fascinating." And so
Mhm.
I was, I think very blessed to have that the right being in the right place, the right time. And
Mhm.
and Templeton really had, they'd been thinking about this question for a while, and we had the beginnings of some interesting empirical data. So I was very, very intrigued about, why does this term beauty come up more often than I've heard it among artists or architects. So there's something in the scientific community that I think makes more space for beauty, and so that's why I set out on this journey for the last 5 years to try to make sense of what this means, why it matters, and yeah, here we are.
Here we are, indeed. Well, those of us who were at your lecture have a pretty good preview to what you've studied and the outcomes that you got, which a number of people that I talked to and Randy talked to after that presentation there on Monday had said to us, "This is fascinating. It's new and insightful for us." Um, I know as in my work and with my colleagues, we run into this all the time, and it goes beyond awe and wonder. That kind of sort of gobsmack moment when you see this the beauty of something to these other levels that you talked about. Maybe just for those of us who weren't and did not hear your first lecture, just give us a thumbnail definition of beauty, perhaps, and that came out of your work, and those 3 points that you elaborated on. And could you do that for us?
Yeah, sure. So we really used an inductive approach here to try to understand what scientists mean by beauty, and so we didn't go in with a operational definition of any sort, but um, we found essentially that there are three main types of beauty. When they're talking about beauty, they mean three sorts of things. One is something like sensory beauty, right? So the beauty of cells and stars, the beauty of the phenomena you study.
Mhm.
There's also the beauty that the intellectual beauty that equations have, for instance, right? But all of
Mhm.
that we think fits in one sort of bucket. It evokes a sense of delight. It also makes it attractive to pursue a scientific career, to sustain you in a scientific career. The second kind of beauty is what we'd call useful beauty. That's beauty as a heuristic, and the research on this topic of beauty in science seems entirely fixated on that. So usually it's based in theoretical physics, and it's the
Mhm.
question of whether beautiful equations are a reliable guide to truth or not, right? And so there's
Yeah.
a lot of dispute around that. Um, the third kind is what we thought was novel and surprising, and that came out of our data pretty strongly, and it's what we're calling the beauty of understanding. So the beauty that is both the sensory beauty and the heuristic beauty are pointing to another form of beauty, which is that grasping of the hidden order or inner logic of things, and that coming together of things, the fitting together of things, that insight into this is how things are, that we think is an aesthetic experience. It's a third form of beauty that we're calling the beauty of understanding, following, in fact, the words of some of the people we talked to. They referred to it that way. So those are the three main types, and we find some diversity across disciplines on
Mhm.
the sort of sensory front, which is physicists are much more drawn to symmetry and
Mhm.
simplicity. Biologists are much more drawn to complexity and to visual beauty. But what they
Mhm.
share in common is the beauty of understanding.
Yeah. 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 I just that's fascinating. So I have the chair this morning, so I'm going to be able to slip in a question here from my own experience. I'm thinking about my PhD work, and you're always trying to say, okay, when have I done enough, and when have I actually really discovered something? And I just can remember the morning that I went out to check. I worked on behavior in a reproductive behavior in an aquatic insect, a caddisfly, these little flying moss-like insects. And we suspected from the literature that they had a pheromone communication system for reproduction. And of course, they're flying typically in the dusk and early morning hours and overnight. You want to, so how do these teenage caddisflies find each other? You know, they're not going to the bar, right? I mean, what's going on in their behavioral repertoire to allow them to meet up? And their eyes are small, and I think on a different group of insects, someone had found that they actually stoneflies use their abdomens to tap on leaves, and they actually and they use a kind of Morse code drumming back and forth. That was fascinating. I said, well, what about chemical modality? And I just remember walking into that stream and had sticky traps there to capture males that would flying to these two females that I'd placed in a canister on another trap. All of the control traps were empty. I think I had one male, one poor lonely male that got caught on a control trap. And of these females, there were 51 males surrounding these stuck on the trap. And it's like, boom. And I just remember the amazing thing is, wow, that's how it works.
Yeah.
And that memory has really stuck with me. As my colleague said, when I got back and showed them the data a week later, they said, that's not ecology data. It's too clean. You made that up. And when you see something like that, I had never thought of it in terms of beauty, but it really, yeah, it is a beautiful thing.
Mm.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I think we've gotten to know you just a little bit, and we're going to open the mics now. Our practice is to ask you to go down to the reactions along the bottom. Usually, it'll be on the bottom, and find the raised hand feature. If you'll raise your hand, and Del Kuhn's looking for his raised hand feature right now, because then Dana will unmute the mics, and we'll call on you as we go along here. And Del, you have submitted a question being first in place this week. And so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and ask Brandon your question.
Okay, thanks, John. Although I think I prefaced my email with not a question, but Brandon, I really enjoyed the talk, and some things surprised me in it. And I'm kind of wondering what were some of the findings that particularly surprised you? And listening to your introduction, I've got a hunch that the simple concept of beauty in your preliminary interviews was one of the things that surprised you most. So as a scientist going in looking for data, you kind of probably hoped you'd expect something, but what were the unexpected things that you came away with?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Yeah, there are a lot of surprises. I mean, yeah, the concept of beauty of understanding, that that understanding itself could be a form of beauty, was novel, and it's one of the strongest findings. It keeps coming up in almost every interview. It's very strong in the statistical data, and so that was for us. It was not something we were looking for. We were attuned to the first two categories, the sensory stuff and then the heuristic stuff, but this was a surprise. The other thing that we found quite surprising was when we had asked scientists in the interviews about how they would define science, what they thought science was about, and there was a lot of reticence to say that science is about truth. They strongly pushed back against the idea that science is the pursuit of truth. And the reason they gave for it was, and this, we did this research in the sort of middle of 2021. They said, look, a lot of people in the pandemic, when they hear scientists changing their minds about public health advice, start to say, "Oh, we can't believe you. You guys, you said this the other day, and now you're changing your mind." So they thought that truth had too dogmatic a perception in the public, and it wasn't helpful for scientists to talk about science as truth. Rather, they thought it was more helpful to talk about science as the pursuit of understanding. So once again, they were leaning into that term understanding as being not just something beautiful that you experience almost as, as a nice, pleasurable experience, but as being the point of science. This is what we're in the business of. It's provisional, it's constantly changing, and it's our best account of what we have, but it's not something that we can hold, dogmatically. So that was again a very strong finding in the interviews. There's some peculiar differences cross-nationally that surprised us, and we don't know how to make sense of it. And there's so many of them, and they're all, they're, so we have a variable, for instance, that measures the psychological disposition towards being attuned to beauty and awe and wonder, and that varies quite a bit. Americans, in the four countries we studied, so U.S., UK, Italy, and India. American scientists are leaps and bounds more inclined on that towards beauty on that variable than scientists in all of the other countries, which we thought was odd. Um, the Italian scientists, they said that they were the least likely to least attuned. They considered themselves to beauty and awe and wonder in their everyday lives, which was exactly the opposite of what we had predicted, because we thought the Italians talked so much about bellezza that we thought they would see it everywhere.
Hmm.
So there are peculiar things like that we don't quite know entirely what's going on. But those were the main ones. I think that for me the most surprising thing personally was how moved I've been by the stories we've heard. In fact, it was one of the stories of a biologist who was studying salmonella, and I think I showed this in my talk. There's an image of the bacterial injection system needle that she shows me that looks identical to a Hindu temple pillar. I had to take my phone out and start. Well, I said I want to get this on camera and I want to make a little video about this, and I wanted to share it with as many people as possible. So when you encounter something beautiful, you want to share it with others. And I essentially was moved to start a podcast and a YouTube channel precisely because I was moved so much by the stories of beauty that I heard among scientists. So that for me has been sort of the biggest surprise is how much I've been impacted by these experiences and stories myself.
I,
How's that, Dell?
I, yeah, fast. Am I on?
Yes.
Fascinating. I think I really enjoy your insights, and I'll put them in the kind of the back of my mind or the front of my mind for the future. I really appreciate it, and you've probably given another generation of grad students some follow-up work to do.
I hope so.
Very helpful indeed. Terry Gray has put a question in the chat, Brandon. He's got a question there that says, I don't remember Brandon using this word, amazing, in his talk. And he says, as a listener to Brandon, I kept translating his word beauty with the word amazement. Could you talk to us about that relationship between those words, those concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the experience of amazement comes up, a number of times when people are talking about where they encounter beauty. We are looking into the varieties of surprise that scientists find in their work, right? And
Mm-hmm.
amazement, we think, is a kind of surprise.
Mm-hmm.
There's the kind of surprise you encounter when there's something unexpected in your results. There's a kind of surprise you encounter when things actually do turn out as you predicted, but you think, wow, I didn't think it would be this straightforward. And there's a surprise there. There's another kind of astonishment when you discover something that completely goes against established knowledge in the field. It's almost revolutionary. And you initially think this has got to be a mistake, but the more you keep verifying it, the more you realize, yeah, this is legit, and everything we've thought so far about this particular species is wrong. So we've encountered all of those modes of we can call them surprise, amazement, right? And there's some valences there that are distinct.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that beauty is related to this kind of surprise in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. You've struck a chord with a number of people, and just before we go to Paul Carr, I'm going to go to John Pohl. John, do you want to unmute and ask your question and or read it out? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks. And this is really a great talk. When I saw this being advertised, I was so happy. So I just a couple things I've wondered about. I've read a couple books by Sabina Hassenfelter, the theoretical physicist, and she has talked quite a bit about the search for beauty, like looking for function constants or looking for symmetry among particles, has really disrupted our ability to study reality scientifically. So we come up with theoretical ideas like string theory that is definitely beautiful, but not testable, and probably is never going to be testable. And then the second part of that is Paul Feyerabend, and his against method basically talks about how anything goes in the scientific method. So when we talk about the scientific method and results of science, is it ordered and beautiful, or is it sometimes chaotic? And I guess my bigger question is, do you think that both order and chaos go together as we study reality, and maybe perhaps randomness is part of divine creation given to us by God as a gift? Thank you.
Yeah, wow, a lot of great questions. Yeah, Sabina's has been very generous interlocutor and supporter of our project. I have a podcast interview with her. If you go to my site or the podcast Beauty at Work, you could find the interview with her. She also was part of a symposium we organized at Oxford a couple of years ago, with a few other scientists and philosophers thinking through this. So I think she's right on this point that if we have a narrow and, as she says, rigid conception of beauty, it can really be misleading, right? And so the way it's worked out in some uh, parts of, or some divisions of theoretical physics and particle physics, there's the assumption that the aesthetic ideals that guided our theory choice in the first half of the 20th century can continue to produce fruitful results. And she says that that's not the case. So when we did find the Higgs boson, about 10 years ago, but that was predicted in the 1960s. And so she's arguing there's no new physics that's coming out of our aesthetic ideals. And we've reached the limit of this particular aesthetic model, right? So the idea that if these equations are really beautiful, even Einstein would say, that the theory is too beautiful not to be true, right? And the experiments can be proven false later. They turn out not to be the case. Um, but at this point, she's arguing that we're wasting too much time and money chasing after beautiful math, and there's really no point, and it's bad because partly, it's a financial thing, and do we really need to build larger and larger colliders, right? And she doesn't think that's a fruitful pursuit. Um, on the scientific method, it's interesting. I mean, Tom McLeish, the late Tom McLeish, who also was one of the advisors to our project, would say that there's no such thing as the scientific method. He liked to say that, I was trained at, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society, and trained at the leading universities and in sciences, and if there was such a thing as scientific method, why wasn't I taught any courses in the scientific method? They don't exist, right? So there are lots of methods, and it's not just one thing. And he wants to argue that the process, the method that scientists follow is not that different from the method that artists follow. That it's a very similar kind of process. Um, I do think there's something to the process of inquiry that is uh, constantly open to surprises, that require intellectual humility, that where the rigor of the process, the value of of the peer community, of peer review, and so on. I mean, all of those things I think are very helpful for the integrity of the sciences. There are a lot of challenges to it. There are philosophers like Nancy Cartwright who argue that today the scientific establishment makes it very difficult to sustain intellectual humility because you have to overinflate all of your claims in order to get a grant. Uh, your funding is the time windows are so short that you can't really answer big questions. So there's a lot of constraints on the scientific method. It doesn't operate as it's supposed to, is the argument. So I think it's a bit more complicated there. I'm trying to think of whether we do find, I think we do have a question where we ask scientists, do they consider the scientific method beautiful? And we do have maybe about half the scientists that we talk to say yes to that. So there's certainly something in that process of, I mean, it's largely around the discovery. It's around the surprise element, right? Being able to actually learn something new. We think it's oriented towards that beauty of understanding. I'm not feeling competent enough to answer the question on the relationship between chaos and randomness and order. I don't know. A theologian would be more competent there, I think. But yeah, it would be it would be above my pay grade.
Brandon, the first thing, John, great question there to get to your point on chaos, and I don't know that field at all myself. It's just that the beautiful diagrams of chaos that come out of those equations, and in particular, I found it very helpful in ecology to start thinking about systems and how the chaotic processes allow systems to jump from one stable state or semi-stable to another. And there's a real beauty in those equations. And if I remember the story correctly, it was somebody had a graph going and an equation running, and they just let it run for a long while, and all of a sudden they begin to see, wait a minute, there's a pattern showing up here. Whoa, something is going on. And I think, to get to back to your first point here, and John, your first question there about the scientific method, I think it really depends on the discipline you're in. I know certainly in ecology, the scientific method was something that we wrote up in our paper at the end after we got done doing all our work. And there's an awful lot of just going out there and mucking around and doing this sort of trying to do a controlled experiment in an ecological system where you have a treatment of one, right, and a control of one, and you think, oh, okay, how do I do an experiment on this thing? And so this is really a fruitful way, I think, to think about science. All right, I'm wandering on, and Paul has been patiently waiting, and so he's going to unmute and ask you a question in a different direction, and then we will go back to the chat. Paul?
Yes. Well, in my book, Beauty and Science and Spirit, I do analyze this aspect of chaos. And for example, I think I cited the fact that the Egyptians kept records of the flooding of the Nile River for like 800 years. If you just looked at the data, it would look random. It doesn't see. But if you analyze it mathematically, it turns out that there is some internal correlation. And it turns out that we all know the story of the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine in the story of Joseph. Well, it turns out that when you analyze the data, that if you have a year of very high flooding, it's more probable that the next few years will also be high. That's mathematically verifiable. And similarly, on the low side, and if there's a very low element of flooding, more probable. And actually, it turns out also, if you analyze it mathematically, it turns out that there's a mathematical, there's a term called a standard deviation. And if the standard deviation goes as the square root, then it's totally random. But most of the natural processes, like the flooding of the Nile or rainfall or tree rings, if you analyze them mathematically, they're not totally random. There's a correlation built in, and this is led to the statement, God plays dice, but the dice are loaded. A lot of natural phenomena, there's a degree of correlation, even though when you look at it, from the outside, just look eyeballing the data, you say, oh, it's random. How can there be beauty? When you analyze it mathematically, there is a correlation and a degree of predictability. So I think that answered that question. But my own question for you is the reason the main theme for writing my book, Beauty and Science and Spirit, was that I find beauty in both. Beauty as a common element to science for me, particularly the comprehensiveness and the predictability of mathematical mathematical descriptions or description of nature is to me is extremely beautiful. And at the same time, I find beauty in religious music, particularly art and liturgy. So is that common, by the way, in your studies? Is that people find beauty as a link, as a common link between science, the beauty of science and the beauty of religion?
Yeah, great questions. Well, Paul, first of all, thanks for your book. I really appreciate it. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it too to our audience. I, so the vast majority of our scientists are not religious, and yet I think there's a lot of appreciation for sacred music, sacred art as kind of a cultural artifact, right? So even Richard Dawkins now would call himself a cultural Christian and says he likes going to church and likes the music and so on. So so I think at that level there is appreciation. One of the things we wanted to see was whether there was any kind of link between artistic training and scientific work. And so, did people find the beauty they experience in science to be similar to the beauty they experience in other domains of life, whether art or music or religion, etc. We found really mixed results. There are some people for whom they say, yeah, it's the same kind of experience, and others who say, no, they're completely different. The beauty of science is it is nothing at all like the beauty of going to a museum or a religious, structure. So we don't quite know, again, what the basis of that difference is, but it seems like there isn't that much alignment. We don't know if there's, if it depends on the type of field or the kind of thing that one would consider, because part of it is also just how they define beauty, and some people are much more restricted in their definitions. But yeah, we still need more research on that to understand what's happening there.
Well, thanks.
Thanks, Paul. America, can we go to you? You unmute.
Thanks very much. I'm retired for a number of years, and I'm finding it very fun that I get to throw out ideas without coming to any great publishable conclusions. So if I'm not incredibly coherent, please forgive me, and I hope it'll twig some interesting things in people's ideas. I was really intrigued where you were saying that among physicists, beauty was perceived as symmetry. And of course, in physics, all the breaking of symmetries in the history of early creation of the universe is fascinating. And that biologists thought of it as complexity. And I've run across that difference, almost an incomprehension, that the experimental physicists can't imagine complexity being beautiful. That's what they want to get rid of and go back to the original. My own background is in geochemistry, and later into big data and satellite imagery and climate and ecosystem modeling and all of that kind of thing. And I tend to group all of the specialties that I have been drawn to. And beauty definitely had a very great thing to do with it. I call them the observational sciences rather than the experimental sciences, the multivariate sciences, in that nothing is ever perfect. There's always a little bit more, or the path-dependent sciences. I don't like to call them the historical sciences, but geology, paleontology, very path-dependent, but we're finding out more and more that so much of what we actually observe is path-dependent. If you ran it over again, it wouldn't come out the same way, but it would still be obeying lots of similar laws. And to move this over into theology, I found it important to distinguish complexity, which to me means interaction of lots of variables to produce what you actually observe at the macro scale, and complication, which is what you get from the bureaucracy. And I don't think any of us think that that's particularly beautiful. And sometimes the perception of beauty is finally discerning some kind of complexity underneath the complication. And that involves going deeper and thinking about things or just letting them go along. I have also found that introducing the variable of time as either a linear variable or a cyclical variable. Makes things rather more interesting, because if you have multiple intersecting cycles through time, you begin to see at a different scale patterns of the intersection of the cycles. If anybody's into Fourier analysis or harmonic analysis, it's as a branch of statistics, it's interesting there. And finally, in the arts, time is incorporated in the arts, in particularly in music, which can be almost pure time if you're into percussion, but also into dance and into tapestry. You have threads which come in at different times and weave together with what's already there differently. And I can't help but have that twig my brain saying this has got something to do with the Trinity that incomparably complex and beautiful, but you just can't talk about it right. The perichoresis is the theological term of the persons of the Trinity dancing around one another, and liturgical dance, or tapestry is similar in the visual realm. I think I don't have much visual perception there, but so there's a whole bunch of half-related ideas that get me really interested in all of this. But even in the highly complex sciences, beauty has a lot to do with what attracts me to them there.
Maybe, Brandon, we can pull a thread out of that.
Yeah.
Or Mirka, do you have a specific question, or we'll let Brandon pull a thread out of that?
If somebody can get a question out of that,
well,
you're welcome to it.
Yeah, there were two things, Brandon. I'm not sure where you're going, but the notion of the Trinity, I don't know if that ever came up in your thinking or in your research, but that might be one to touch on. But do you have a sense of this these relationships that Mirka's talking about?
On the Trinity, no, I don't think that came up at all in our work. But I mean, I think we were talking, earlier about, I think maybe there's a comment in the chat from Mike about death that reminded me, John, of the conversation you and I were having before the session. I mean, I do think that, if Christ is the pattern of reality, there's something, fundamental about the Trinity and even the cross that we should expect to find somehow in the natural order, right? Some way in which that would give us insight into how things are at the deepest level. But yeah, I really like actually the way Mirka, that you've divided the observational, multivariate, and historical, if I could call it that. I would wonder if we had a way of categorizing our scientists into those buckets, whether we would find some differences in the types of beauty that they're drawn to, or something else. So that's
the first time I really came up hard against this in a practical way was when I was judging elementary school science fairs at a regional level. And the science fairs were set up almost exclusively to teach kids how to do simple experiments. And I was not particularly interested in their experiments. I was interested in, from geology background or a biology background, in observation.
Yeah. I think that's really important. Yeah, the kind of modal understanding of what science is, I think, is it's something that Tom McLeish again had written about, where he says, a lot of high school students would come to him and say, they were not drawn to the sciences because they considered themselves to be creative and didn't see any room for creativity in science, right? And Andrea Wolff, the science writer, talks about she's a metaphor of science as a palace with many doors. And she says we hold only one or two of these doors open for people. And there's so many others, right, that we don't really realize are there. So I think that's kind of your experience there, I think, right? I mean, if only the door of simple experiments is open and you don't realize there's all of these other pathways into the sciences, that we're doing an injustice to our children.
No, that's very helpful to give us a little richness of the concept. What jumped, Mirka, your classification maybe jumped to think about how the scientific method is often linked with disciplines and specific disciplinary ways of seeing and understanding. And today the emphasis is on relationality, building teams, and interdisciplinarity. The questions that we have are larger than any one specific method or disciplinary approach can yield. So this is a helpful conversation. Thank you for that. Brandon, I want to turn to Mike Beidler's question that's in the chat, and you just touched on it a second ago about the death. And Mike says, it strikes me that death can be considered an ugly thing in terms of personal emotional impact, yet death is an entirely necessary thing to sustain life. Mike, you want to say any more about that and elaborate that question?
I don't know if I can talk too much more to that point other than to say there are a lot of things that may be components of a larger beauty that are not as beautiful as we would like them to be. Yet, when looked at from a different perspective, it can take on a different quality of beauty because it is a component of a larger beauty. I just think that the paradox is striking. And I think you touched on that when you were talking about the Trinity and how Jesus' death on the cross was necessary to give us life. And in that way, I mean, that's why we call it a Good Friday, is it not?
Brandon, I take it that in your interviews, that concept of death, did that intrude? Did it arise in any sense in the conversations?
Yeah, we had we did a follow-up study just this in the last 8 or 9 months actually of another 100 scientists from our sample to ask them about their existential questions and spiritual longings. And so we did talk about death a lot actually. And whether questions like, if you if you knew you only had 3 weeks to live, would you do something differently, right? And experiences of grief and mourning, when people close to you pass away, how do you process that? And we had a sample of mostly non-religious scientists, and we're trying to see how they think through these questions and how they make sense of them. So yeah, again, it's we're still analyzing that data. It's pretty rich, and of course there's very strong differences. There are a few people who are people of faith, and you do see some very strong differences there. But yeah, I think ultimately, like for a lot of people, this is the experience of death, whether the close family member or one's own impending death, and thinking about it is something that forces you to ask bigger questions, right? That you when things are going well and you're on the kind of hamster wheel of climbing the ladder or chasing after promotions and so on, you're not thinking about. But it's something that a lot of people struggle with and don't have, especially those who've closed themselves off to faith. They don't, they don't quite know how to process that. They want to believe there's nothing more to this life than we're just atoms and molecules, and that's really it. But I'll give you one example of, that really moved me was a scientist who had lost a dear friend who he hadn't been in touch with for many years, and he went to her memorial and found himself standing in front of her remains and talking to her. Right, and she'd passed away, and he was expressing this remorse of not having been a better friend. And part of him was watching himself doing this and say, there's no one here. There's nothing here. This is, just atoms and molecules. Like, this is not a person, and he wasn't satisfied with that, right? So there's some yearning that we have for something beyond, and confronting us, when we're confronted with death, I think that it makes us really have to deal with that.
Right. Mike, thank you for that question, because it's really sparked something in my mind. Brandon, I had said to Brandon earlier, and many of you know, for a number of years, I've been thinking about death in ecology in particular, and its role in life and how it works and what it is. And it strikes me, Brandon, as I'm listening to you define death or beauty and talk about it and then parse it out, we have the similar problem with the word death. We have one word, we use it for a variety of context events, and it's highly contextualized. It depends. You've gone to talking about our personal experiences of death and meaning in life. As an ecologist, when I see death, that's how we perceive beauty. Without programmed cell death, we don't have clear uh, eyesight. We can't see unless the cell mechanisms die and the cell clears out so that we can actually see through it. But it's greater than that. We don't even see beauty, for instance, in a tree. If you look at a tree and you look at the structure that it has, well, that structure comes from developmental biological processes, which mean that certain things shut down, certain things die and recede. So death is present in all of the beauty that we see in ways that it strikes me we don't have good language. So your work on beauty is really helping us to get better language and better ways, as Mirka was describing, better ways to think about these things, right? We get locked into uh, almost tunnel vision, right? We're marching down a certain way and seeing it. And, well, there's an entirely different way. Look at it this way. Um, One friend said years ago, it's a sort of difference between what they called Hebrew thinking and Greek thinking. Greek is logical and structured and very carefully procedural, and the Hebrews kind of walk around the question and say, isn't that interesting? You know, and say, and it's the wholes and parts. There's all different ways to talk about that. So, Mike, again, thanks for that question. Um, I'm madly looking over to the right here so I can see if there's any other new questions that have popped in. As we're closing in on the end of our hour, is there any? I don't see any other hands raised there uh, at the moment. And if not, if there's not a burning one, Brandon.
Looks like there's a question here from Vlad.
Oh yes, Vlad
Trying to
did
read
have a question
that.
there. Sorry,
There's a question
Vlad.
from
Do you want to? You're
Yeah,
unmuted. Go ahead. Ask away. Thank you.
yeah. I guess just a little comment regarding the previous topic on the subject of death. The topic of medical assistance in dying may be relevant in this context, as we are trying to convert the experience of dying into something more beautiful. I've been doing some reading on this recently, and it's a topic worth reading up on. My question really is regarding the beauty resulting from understanding the world around us through science. Would you agree that understanding God and the messages from God would fall into the same category of beauty? And maybe a follow-up question, how can we sort of advance this understanding of God and the messages from God, either by better understanding of the Bible or other written works inspired by God, to capture the beauty that is inherent in better understanding?
Yeah, no, I do think maybe potentially all forms of understanding are experiences of beauty, right? In as much as they provide a sense of connection and fit and harmony. So there are certain aesthetic principles that are inherent to the act of understanding. Um, I suppose you can, but it's not necessarily always guaranteed to point to truth, right? So you can achieve understanding through a conspiracy theory, right? And that could be a very beautiful experience if you're like, aha, now I understand why people are doing this and so on, right? But it could be completely wrong. So that's I think the challenge with beauty is it's not guaranteed to be tethered to truth and to goodness. So you can have beauty without truth and beauty without goodness. And so it requires some work and some vigilance to connect those things. Yeah, I do think an understanding the Word of God should be an experience of beauty. I think it needs to uh, you know it often doesn't happen this way, but when we are introducing people to faith or communicating the faith, it needs to be beautiful, right? In order for the understanding I think it improves understanding if it is presented in a beautiful way rather than simply, like this is true, right? And so I think beauty has some relevance both to communication and understanding. Um, and I do think, whether you're reading exegesis or contemporary scholarship or popular writers who are trying to illuminate some aspect of the Word of God, I think beauty plays a role there. Um, yeah. On the topic of the assisted suicide and so on, I just remember there was this ad in Canada actually, but I think it was a Simons Foundation. It was an ad promoting euthanasia, and they used the word beauty a lot. And there's almost this idea of this is a more beautiful life, one in which you can opt out, right? And so it's very clear they're competing ideals of beauty, and it's not immediately obvious, which vision of beauty is aligned with the truth, and I'm not a subjectivist entirely when it comes to beauty, right? I mean, I think someone else had written on the chat about, beauty being in the eye of the beholder. There is a subjective aspect to it, but I also think our perceptions of what is beautiful can change, and gaining better understanding and uh, a better awareness of truth can modify what we find beautiful, which is also what Sabina Hassenfelder tries to argue.
Well, thank you for that. That's a good question. I'm going to go to Terry Gray for the next question. Terry, you want to unmute there and
Sure. I mean, you just touched on what I was going to ask about. Maybe there is an expansion in order, but somebody wrote "Beauty's in the eyes of the beholder." Perhaps another cruder way of saying it is that there's no accounting for taste. Is another common phrase. And it seems to me that your definitions of beauty have actually suggested that it's not a simple aesthetic thing that maybe I don't know who the philosophers or artists want to emphasize. But I just and another thought that's been crossing my mind is I'm a protein crystallographer, and in the very first protein structure that came out in the early 60s, late 50s, it was perceived as being ugly, visceral even. And we've gone now to computer graphics models that are quite lovely and beautiful and pleasing to the eye. I'm just wondering about this question of subjectivity in beauty and to what degree we can objectify it.
Yeah. No, it's a really great, fantastic question, and it's pretty thorny. I think it's the one that philosophers have been debating for, millennia now. And I don't, I think there's a subjective element to beauty. I think it's hard to talk about beauty without implying anyway that one is delighted, right? That one sort of is moved in some way. Um, but you can, right? You can talk about a piece of art that you think is beautiful, even if at the moment you don't feel like it. I remember being on a hike a number of years ago in these gorgeous mountains of Tennessee, and I had a really bad stomach upset, and there was nothing that I could do to convince myself there was any beauty around me when my body was feeling horrible, right? So, but one can object, you can sort of say, well, there is beauty here, right? You can recognize it, you just don't feel it. Um, and then the challenge with these objective notions of beauty, whether it's equations or theories or works of art, is we do change in our tastes as societies. I think there's a much more contextual maybe element to beauty where there's an interaction between the object and the observer and the community that's making sense of it, right? So that's constantly what's going on even in science when we talk about a beautiful theory. It's one that a particular scientific community has recognized in terms of its aptness, right? So, we can say now that the epicycles upon epicycles that were used, about 1,000 years ago are not really beautiful, but back then that was what they would consider the most beautiful way to depict the orbits of planets, right? Um, so it poses a thorny question where it's certainly not purely subjective, at least not in an idiosyncratic sense. It depends to some degree on a community of people searching together and making aesthetic judgments together. It has something to do with truth because we can see that the things we recognize are no longer true cease to be as beautiful as they used to be, right? The things that we consider as not no longer good cease to have that aesthetic appeal. So it has some relation to it, but it's hard to sort of put into one of those buckets very neatly, I think.
Very good, Terry. Thank you for that question. I think we'll turn now, Paul, to a last question. If you have a question for us, unmute.
Oh, well, I just have a comment on the subject of death. I can give you both a terrestrial example and a cosmic example. The fertile soil that nourishes our food and produces our food basically came from the death of decayed plants. So those plants had died and decayed. There'd be no fertile soil to nurture our life. And this happens cosmically. It turns out that, our stars start out with hydrogen and then they fuse, and all the elements are fused together in stars, and they explode at the end of their lifetime into cosmic dust. And then the gravity pulls the dust back together to make new stars and new planets. And indeed our solar system in which we live came from the death of an ancient star. So it's interesting that the idea that death nurtures new life and new cosmic bodies.
That's right.
There's that commonality. It seems strange. It's sort of built into the fabric of the universe.
Yes. Brandon, if I could on this, I'll insert. Randy, Isaac, and I have been going back. Many of you know that Randy and Steve Freeland have done a series in our Perspectives journal on the origin of life and abiogenesis, life out of nothing. And some time ago, I asked Randy the question, is where does death fit into the origin of life? Death in some ways is a pushing, or life, pardon me, is a pushing death back and away. Again, we don't have, and Paul, to your point, is that just recently, in the last year, there's been another paper coming out showing a kind of regularity in the cosmic evolution of stars and element formation as one example, and a number of examples of destruction leading to construction. And as an extension, they're proposing an extension of laws of thermodynamics, maybe a new kind of understanding. Very speculative at the moment, but it goes, Brandon, to what you're leading us to, is that we start asking these questions that aren't being asked, and they open up, like this question about beauty, into very fruitful conversations and new ways of thinking. And that, after all, is what we in the social and natural sciences are all about, right? Is discovering further the wonders and the beauty and the majesty and the mystery of God's great creation, thinking God's thoughts after him, all of these different phrases we use. So thank you, Brandon, today for helping us to think more. My notebook is filled with ideas. Thank all of you for participating, the good questions that came. Terry Defoe has just said at the bottom here, beauty is motivating. Terry, it certainly is. And it's deeply motivating for all of us. And Brandon, you have motivated us, and we will continue this conversation. So please join us next month in our next Diving Deeper. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you all.